Well, good evening, everybody, and a warm welcome to the March 2021 Acting for Justice presentation. My name is Jack Jezreel. I serve on the staff of Just Faith Ministries, and I'm just delighted you could join us tonight. I'd like to remind all of you that 2021 is our 20th anniversary. What began as a single program 20 years ago called Just Faith has evolved into an organization with more than a dozen programs on an array of topics, from hunger to racism to climate change to spirituality, all supporting the work and growth of social mission across the country. And over 65,000 people have participated in our programs, and the impact is that many people's lives have changed, deflected in the direction of human suffering, in the cause of seeking justice, and in response to the cry of the earth. Those 65,000 people have almost certainly touched 1 million lives or more. You will hear more about our 20th anniversary celebration this September in the months to come. Again, welcome to tonight's gathering. I'd like to begin in prayer. Just a note, our prayer this evening comes from a resource that our speaker tonight will describe in her presentation. So let us pray. Create in me a love ever more open, Lord, that I may move beyond myself, that I may transcend man-made borders, that I may go to the periphery, that I may seek the hidden exile, that I may offer generous hospitality, and that I may rid racism from my heart. In this way, may I help create conditions where every person can thrive, where community replaces isolation, where racism is stamped out, where justice is restored, where work, land, and housing are available for all, and where the human family can live in harmony. Guide us on the journey to the true path of peace, Lord. Help us live out your vision of a world where no one is excluded and the earth's goods are shared and cared for by all. Amen. My pleasure to introduce you to tonight's presenter, Jill Rauh. Jill is the Director of Education and Outreach in the Office of Justice, Peace, and Human Development of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, which is the longest job title in the history of human speech. She holds a Bachelor of Arts from Marquette University, an MA in Theology from Washington Theological Union, and an MA in International Affairs from George Washington University. Before joining the U.S. Bishops Conference in 2007, Jill served as Senior Program Associate of the Education for Justice Project at the Center of Concern, worked in civic engagement with Latino youth, helped lead parish and campus ministry efforts, and served as an international volunteer with Rostro de Cristo in Ecuador. Jill was our very first Acting for Justice speaker last March, and we're delighted she could join us again this year. Jill, it's very nice to have you.
Thank you so much, Jack. It is great to be here with all of you. I'm always really so glad to be with the Just Faith Network, since my own parish experience with Just Faith years ago was a really fantastic one. Our time in community equipped my parish group to take action through a new ESL ministry and re-engaging with the parish's involvement in faith-based community organizing. And also, I'm really beyond delighted that even more recently, the U.S. Catholic Bishop Subcommittee on the Catholic Campaign for Human Development is really actively encouraging Catholic parishes to take advantage of Just Faith's wonderful and impactful Catholic programming. So thank you, Just Faith, for all that you do to help our communities cultivate a deeper faith that spurs action. So it's great to be back with you all. And today I feel particularly blessed to be able to break open with you the rich teaching letter or encyclical of Pope Francis that is called Fratelli Tutti. This document is not a quick one and done type of encyclical at 287 paragraphs. It's pretty robust, and we won't be able to cover everything, but we are going to cover some main points. And in this encyclical, Pope Francis really confronts head on some of the major challenges that we're facing in our world today and in our communities right here in the United States. And he invites us to reorient our hearts and how we relate to one another and really to the world, to truly become brothers and sisters to one another. And, as with any encyclical, I think the best place for us to begin is by looking at the context in which it was written, looking at what realities in the world and in our communities was Pope Francis responding to when he wrote this really beautiful document. So I think, let's begin by looking at the first chapter, which is entitled Dark Clouds Over a Closed World. And one dark cloud that he's talking about is the really obvious one. While I was writing this letter, he says, the COVID-19 pandemic unexpectedly erupted, exposing our false securities and our fragmentation. And he writes, anyone who thinks that the only lesson to be learned was the need to improve what we're already doing or to refine the existing systems and regulations is denying reality. So a significant context of this encyclical is the current crisis and how it has brought to light long hidden injustices. Let's think about that for a moment. The pandemic has illustrated, Pope Francis writes in this encyclical, that we live in a throwaway world that looks at how useful people are rather than their inherent value and dignity. This throwaway culture normalizes the discarding of others, whether we're talking about communities that we were slow to protect from the pandemic, or those not yet born, or our obsession with reducing labor costs, or victims of slavery or trafficking. And he criticizes our profit-based economic model that he says does not hesitate to exploit, discard, or even kill human beings. So some pretty strong language, but he's telling it like it is. We are suffering, he says, a globalized indifference, which has made us forget that we're all in the same boat. He says that ours is a culture of exclusion, and he lifts up, as case in point, the plight of migrants around the world who are turned away at borders, or once in a new country, they're made into exiles, he says, by racism once they arrive. And an underlying cause of this is that we've been conditioned towards a dangerous individualism, which does not make us more free or equal or better brothers or sisters, instead the opposite. And we're also seeing, Pope Francis writes, a myopic, extremist, resentful, and aggressive nationalism that's on the rise. These extremist perspectives and polarization are worsened, he says, by a loss of historical consciousness and the use of rhetoric and hyperbole for political purposes that manipulates followers. In addition, the digital world, which can facilitate new forms of positive encounter, is also misused. And it gives free rein to ideologies that allow fear to overtake call to love. Wow. So I'll just pause for a moment to note that the dark clouds that Pope Francis writes about must be very large ones, because they extend all the way from where he is to our own country. Racism, xenophobia, unhealthy nationalism, these things are all too familiar to us. And meanwhile, how the pandemic has played out in the US illustrates well the concepts like the throwaway world and economic models that prioritize profit over people. We've seen great disparities, and the wealth of the country's 650 billionaires actually growing by $1 trillion in the 8 months after the start of the pandemic, while at the same time, we have 26 million people who are currently facing food insecurity. We have many white-collar workers with the luxury of staying at home and being safe, ordering everything we need online, while 500,000 agricultural workers, according to a recent study, have tested positive for the virus, and at least 9,000 have died from it. I recently saw an interview with the pastor of a parish in Southern California, and he was lamenting, his heart was broken that he was doing an average of 10 burials a week. So we have a lot of these disparities to wrestle with. The persistence of systemic racism has been clearly illustrated during the pandemic, as we've seen African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanics, Latinos all infected at disproportionately high rates. And a few weeks ago, it was reported that the life expectancy gap between Black and white Americans is now at 6 years, which is the widest in over 20 years. And then, of course, globally, we're seeing informal workers and women in particular affected economically in poor countries. And there's a current debate over vaccine access for the men, women, and children who happen to live in countries that were not well enough off to negotiate dosages for their populations first. So the dark clouds are many, and I don't begin like this in order to depress you. But Pope Francis, while he brings these things up, has and yet, he notes that God continues to sow abundant seeds of goodness in our human family. And the invitation that he's making to us through this encyclical is our hearts are wrenched apart by the pandemic, by the racial injustice, by the brutal and divisive past year especially. Despite these things, we're drawn to join Pope Francis in his call, because what he's offering is a faith-infused vision of what we are called to. And it is in these moments of immense suffering, Pope Francis writes, that we can discover once and for all that we need one another, and that in this way our human family can experience a rebirth and all its faces, all its hands, and all its voices beyond the walls that we have erected. And so with our remaining time together, I'm going to outline 5 things that Pope Francis tells us we can do, in fact, that we must do in our hearts and through our actions as we contribute to this rebirth of the human family and this reimagining of our future together that he is inviting us to. And so we'll begin with the first call that he makes, which is to overcome indifference. Pope Francis offers the parable of the Good Samaritan, which we are all familiar with in Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37, as our guidepost that we seek to find a way forward. He writes, the parable shows us how a community can be rebuilt by men and women who identify with the vulnerability of others, who reject the creation of a society of exclusion, and instead act as neighbors, lifting up and rehabilitating the fallen for the sake of the common good. The invitation that he's making is to remember our very purpose. We are created for a fulfillment that can only be found in love. We cannot be indifferent to suffering. Instead, we should feel indignant, challenged to emerge from our comfortable isolation and be changed by our contact with human suffering. Pope Francis tells us a story that illustrates this perfectly in his new book, Let Us Dream. Maybe some of you have read it, which in my opinion, if you want to understand what Fratelli Tutti is about without necessarily reading the entire thing, although I do recommend that you do that, read Let Us Dream, because it really explains where he's coming from. But anyway, the story that he tells in Let Us Dream is this. So in Argentina, Pope Francis would say Mass in La Plaza, and he noticed that some who gathered for Mass were cartoneros. And those are the boys who scoured the streets at night in search of cardboard and other materials to sell to recyclers. Well, one night, he was in his apartment and he was watching out the window, and he was surprised because he was watching the cartoneros and he thought that he saw one of their carts pulled by a horse. But he knew that couldn't be because live animals were banned by the city laws. They weren't allowed to have live animals pull the cart. And he realized with a sinking heart that the cart was pulled not by horses, but by 2 small boys, because apparently a child was worth less than a horse. And so Pope Francis was moved by this, and he was disgusted by this. And he decided to put away his pectoral cross and put on civilian clothing and go out and join the cartoneros in their rounds. And so he spent the evening with them, and they had no idea who he was. and he got to know them. He literally walked with them during their rounds. And in this experience of encounter, he saw and knew because he was trying to see through the eyes of the others. And so why do I share this story? It's because we cannot be Christians and be indifferent to the struggles of God's people on the margins. Indifference is the opposite of what it means to be Christians. And we might not think of ourselves as indifferent, but if we're not going out of our way to encounter, not making ourselves uncomfortable by getting our hands dirty, then maybe we are indifferent. Before we reflect a little bit more on that, I just want to note that the call here is not just to reflect abstractly on this challenge. It's an actual call to conversion of heart that leads to discernment and prayer about how we must pray differently, think differently, be different, act different. And so I want to pause actually before we move to the second theme, the second challenge, because I want to give you some questions to think about yourself. Maybe not now, but write them down for later if you like. And the first question is, to who is suffering have you maybe been indifferent? In the pandemic, no community has been unaffected, but some communities have been really affected. And so how has this dark cloud helped you to see the realities of inequality, for example, that were easy to ignore before, but you can't ignore them now? And how have you felt moved to accompany? How have you felt moved to act? And a second question, what prevented you from seeing the other before? And what did you do, or do you need to do in order to begin to see? I was thinking about this question in my own life. And, for a long time, like many white people, I believed that we lived in a post-racism world. Why? Because I grew up in a community that lacked diversity, and I didn't make an intentional effort to see. It wasn't until I was a young adult that I began to be intentional about developing relationships with people from other cultural and economic backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds, At first, I didn't ask questions because it was uncomfortable, or I didn't like to think about how I might benefit from other people's marginalization. Seeing can involve confronting difficult truths like the pervasiveness of racism that stretches far into our institutions, and how people who look like me benefit from that, and the difficult work that we're called to in order to remedy that. So what has prevented you from seeing the other? And what do you need to do in order to begin to see? And then what do you need to change in order to see? Take that question to prayer and just see how God speaks to you. So I want to move on to the next theme, the next response that we're called to, and that is the call to build universal love instead of walls. So we aren't only called to see. We're not only called to stop being indifferent. We have to be neighbors without borders, Pope Francis writes. He points out that the parable of the Good Samaritan is quite specific, that the one who helps is from Samaria, where pagan rites were practiced, making Samaritans impure, detestable, dangerous. So this encounter of mercy is highly provocative. It challenges us to expand our frontiers and gives universal dimension to the call to love, Pope Francis writes. So a universal call to love, what does that mean? Well, the first thing I would say, drawing from Fratelli Tutti, is that we're called to authentic encounter. Encounter leads to hearts that are open, despite our culture of walls that seeks to raise walls in our hearts, walls on the land, all sorts of other kinds of walls. The call to encounter. I was moved by a story that was shared with me several years ago by a parish outreach coordinator. And I remembered it as I was preparing for my time with you. And the job of this parish outreach coordinator was to coordinate adult service projects in a parish that was very service committed, but it was also very politically polarized. And so thinking about this, she did something that was actually quite ingenious. She sent the pro-life advocates to the border to a site that was aiding recently arrived families. And she sent the social justice advocates to a crisis pregnancy center. They were not all happy to be going to the place that they didn't really want to go. They wanted to go vice versa. But the experience was transformational for both groups. And she started actually institutionalizing that in terms of where she sent people for service. Because the fact is that universal love can only happen when we break down walls, when we build bridges through encounter. And that was a perfect example of facilitating that encounter. And then another thing I want to point out is that the act of encounter moves us towards universal openness, which Pope Francis says is reaching out toward the margins to include those whom I do not naturally consider as part of my circle of interests, even though they are close to me. So think back to the example earlier of how the pandemic has for many communities revealed disparities and inequalities that maybe you never thought about before. It's created some dissonance for, those who have the luxury of maybe waiting in the comfort of my own home for my Whole Foods order to come while somebody else is shopping for me. The food was picked by migrant workers at risk of COVID, processed by workers who probably had to fight for their most basic safety protections. I don't always think of these people as part of my circle of interests, but they are. And the challenge and invitation here is to see and then encounter the hidden exile among us. Pope Francis spends some time in Fratelli Tutti on both the economic systems that prioritize profit over people and on the plight of the migrant hidden exile. He challenges us to develop a more just system toward migrants and refugees arriving at our door, for they are often fleeing from violence and desperate poverty. The international community, he says, has a right to resolve those issues, or has a responsibility to resolve those issues, because people have a right not to migrate. But until that's achieved, people have a right to migrate to fulfill their basic needs. And yet, in our culture of exclusion, we create situations of the hidden exile in our midst as we reject newcomers, reject those whose cultures and ethnicities are different from our own. And so how do we act on this universal call to love? Well, we have to work to create systems that welcome, including the immigration system. We have to work to eliminate the nationalism, xenophobia, contempt, and even the mistreatment of those who are different that we often see and hear around us, and maybe we're even part of sometimes. We also have to work intentionally to cross the falsely constructed walls that are everywhere. Pope Francis gives an example of crossing these falsely constructed walls in the very writing of this encyclical, since it was inspired by his friendship across the walls we often create with the Grand Imam Ahmed Al-Tayeb, who is an Egyptian scholar and Muslim leader. And he had co-authored a document on human fraternity with Grand Imam Ahmed Al-Tayeb. And many of the themes that appear in that document also appear in Fratelli Tutti. And we saw Pope Francis, of course, even more recently, give a really clear example of breaking down walls in his recent visit to Iraq, where he met with Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani and other Muslim leaders. And so what is that call to break down walls? How can we do that in our own lives? How can we imitate Pope Francis? Well, again, there's an invitation to reflect deeply. If we don't have time to do that at this moment, write these questions down, take them to prayer with you for your quiet time to hear the challenge that the Lord is providing. Have you ever felt excluded? And who do we exclude? Where do we construct walls, either intentionally or unintentionally? And also, this is a really important question, where in your own sphere of influence can you help facilitate encounter? Like the parish leader who sent the service groups to the sites opposite from what they expected. This is so important because it is encounter that can allow us to overcome indifference. Let me just give you a second to think about those questions and get a sip of water. And then I think we'll move on to the next slide. And so moving into the third response that Pope Francis invites us to, listen and prioritize the grassroots voices. So again, in this work to reorient our hearts and our society as we reimagine together, we have to listen and we have to prioritize in our listening people from the grassroots. I want to point out that while Congress was embattled intense debates over the last year around federal legislation on the nation's COVID response and other really important laws, the 200 plus grassroots community organizations that receive funding from the Catholic Church through the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, or CCHD, were on the ground listening and responding. I'm going to give you just a few examples because I think these are the seeds of hope that Pope Francis is talking about that we need to listen to. I want to tell you about Dallas area Interfaith, which includes several Catholic parishes as members, along with many other faith traditions. Dallas area Interfaith, the members immediately, when COVID started, called 3,000 of their member families over 2 weeks to ask about their needs. And then, based on what they heard, they got everybody on board to virtually start working with and putting pressure on county health officials to accept access to COVID testing, to accept the IDs that the parish had previously created for undocumented persons. They had created these IDs to keep undocumented persons safe so that they could have a relationship with the local police. Well, they got these IDs actually accepted for COVID testing to get access for a population that initially had been excluded. They also organized to achieve a moratorium on evictions and electricity shutoffs. And then meanwhile, one state over, a different group called Together Louisiana brought together members to tackle education equity during the pandemic, including access to broadband, distribution of devices to kids in low-income communities, and making sure that everybody could go to virtual school and actually learn something, because as we know, that's been a major issue with how virtual school has gone. In Missouri, here's another example, Rural Workers Community Alliance, which is made up of workers in pork processing. They brought nationwide attention to unsafe conditions in one of the plants. Workers were in confined areas. They were working shoulder to shoulder without proper protective gear. They're really being denied their rights. And so their work and the attention that they drew resulted in a lawsuit on behalf of the workers, and that ultimately resulted in some changes to their conditions. One final example of the effectiveness of grassroots voices during this pandemic, Amos, a faith-based organizing group in Iowa, and its low-income members organized to do something about the jammed unemployment office phone lines and websites. All these people unemployed, nobody could get through. And also, those phone lines and websites happen to only be in English, despite a significant refugee population. And so they organized, they worked together, and their work resulted in 100 additional staff being hired by the state to handle call volume and to add translations to languages spoken by the area's workers, many of whom are refugees. These might seem like they're small, hard-won victories, but they're ones that in some cases have been life-saving as COVID has ravaged communities. And these are just the most recent examples of work that has been done consistently over the last 50 years by hundreds of groups supported with usually around $10 million of grants every year from the Bishop's Catholic Campaign for Human Development, funds that come from the parishes from the collection for CCHD. And these efforts are different than many anti-poverty efforts because everything that is funded is led and run by low-income people themselves. And so why is this important or relevant to Fratelli Tutti? Well, it's because when Pope Francis reflects, and this is both in Let Us Dream and in Fratelli Tutti, he says, this is the deep change we need, change that arises from people capable of meeting, organizing, and coming up with truly human proposals. And this is the type of work that he's talking about. Pope Francis himself knows well the work of grassroots leaders. In fact, many of you may know that since 2014, the Vatican has been holding something called meetings of popular movements, and they bring together people from the grassroots who are working for change. I actually have a photo of, on the next slide here, of in 2017, the Vatican, CCHD, and major faith-based organizing networks in the US held a US regional meeting of popular movements. And for Pope Francis, when he writes in Fratelli Tutti about integral human development, he says that it goes beyond the idea of social policies being policies that are for the poor. He says the voices of people in poverty should instead be at the forefront of developing these solutions because they know best what is needed to solve their own problems. Pope Francis spends ample time fleshing out this concept in Let Us Dream, and he criticizes the idea that we can just make a few adjustments here and there after the pandemic is over and simply go back to the same systems that created many of the problems that have come to light. Something more substantial is needed. He says we must redesign the economy so that it can offer every person access to a dignified existence while protecting and regenerating the natural world. And the popular and grassroots movements that have been for so many years seeking to develop new models and creative solutions need to be at the center of that. And when we talk about these groups and the long work they've been doing, they've been working for the last 50 years on preserving and increasing affordable housing in cities and advocating for a living wage on which a family can live. They've been introducing restorative justice models to communities and at schools. They've been working on peace building and improving police-community relations, protecting immigrant rights, ensuring access to healthy food and good health care in neighborhoods, and so much more. And that work is, of course, often done ecumenically or even in an interfaith capacity. And for Pope Francis, this work alongside other faiths in the pursuit of peace, justice, and fraternity, as he says in Fratelli Tutti, is an expression of our universal openness and love. So all of these things fit together, as you can see. The last chapter, in fact, chapter 8, is called Religions at the Service of Fraternity in Our World. And it's exactly about this cooperation across our faith traditions to build peace instead of walls, to do justice together. So I don't have any reflection questions for this one, but I do have a homework assignment, which is go to the URL that you see there, povertyusa.org /CCHD-groups, or the other one ending in stories, because you can find out who is working in your community, who you can partner with to work on these local issues led by grassroots voices and the people who actually should be coming up with the solutions, which is the people who are most affected. So number 4, and this one will be a little shorter because it's really a continuation of numerous points that I've already made. But Fratelli Tutti also really emphasizes the call to address the structural causes of poverty and inequality. And we've seen them even more clearly because of the pandemic. And while addressing people's short-term immediate needs is, of course, really important, and it's an important, essential ministry that we do as churches, we also have to be advocating so that all people in our common home that we all share can thrive. Pope Francis writes, solidarity means much more than engaging in sporadic acts of generosity. It means thinking and acting in terms of community. It means that the lives of all are prior to the appropriation of goods by a few. It means combating the structural causes of poverty, inequality, the lack of work, land, and housing, the denial of social and labor rights. Solidarity, understood in its most profound meaning, is a way of making history. So we cannot make just a few adjustments after the pandemic is over and simply go back to the same systems that create many of the problems that have come to light. Once our current crisis passes, he writes, our worst response would be to plunge even more deeply into feverish consumerism and new forms of egotistic self-preservation. Development, local and global, he writes, must not aim at the amassing of wealth by a few, but ensure human rights, personal and social, economic and political, including the rights of nations and people. The right of some to free enterprise or market freedom cannot supersede the rights of people and the dignity of the poor, or for that matter, respect for the natural environment. So he's really making the connections there between the need to have development and economic systems that prioritize people first, and which also have in mind concern for our common home. He also says that we have to be attentive to the needs and rights of the global poor. Inherent dignity demands that each have what they need to thrive, no matter their circumstances or talents. In addition, in some of the later chapters in the encyclical, he gets into some of the areas that probably have attracted more media attention than some of these compelling and inspiring other themes. But, he calls us to not only reject war, which really is almost impossible to be waged for just reasons, he says, but also to actively work for peace. For peace is not merely the absence of war, but a tireless commitment, especially on the part of those of us charged with greater responsibility to recognize, protect, and concretely restore the dignity so often overlooked or ignored of our brothers and sisters, so that they can be the principal protagonists of the destiny of their nation. Poverty and violence are connected, and addressing poverty means a more peaceful world. So all of this, and I know that it's a lot, but the encyclical is a lot. So sorry, but blame Pope Francis. I am reminded of Isaiah chapter 58. Is this not rather the fasting that I choose, releasing those bound unjustly, untying the thongs of the yoke, setting free the oppressed, breaking off every yoke? It's a verse that I've been reflecting on a lot over this season. Make your Lenten fast, responding to one action alert every week. Sign up to get action alert emails if you don't already from the USCCB, from CRS, from RED, from so many other organizations that just do great work and give you a really easy way to act again and to change some of the systems and structures through policy, through legislation. Or like locally, is your city council meeting virtually now? No more excuses to not be involved, right? Because you don't even have to go anywhere. Or, think about how you can work in community, how you can work with some of those local organizations that I mentioned a moment ago, or start planning now to join, hundreds of Catholics. We just had 1,000 people join us virtually for the Catholic Social Ministry Gathering, which is an annual social ministry conference, and will be in person next year in January. But we go to the Hill. We do advocacy with our elected officials on behalf of those who are poor and vulnerable. So there's so many easy ways we can advocate. And the challenge, I think, to respond to this is to get involved in whatever way you can. So finally, a fifth challenge, the challenge to a better kind of politics, which is the title of chapter 5 in Fratelli Tutti. I'm not going exactly in chronological order here. But in chapter 5, and I think this is a really compelling one to end on, Pope Francis reflects on the rise of an unhealthy populism globally, where leaders, this is a quote, seek popularity by appealing to the basest and most selfish inclinations of certain sectors of the population. Or he writes, and even less extreme circumstances, he says, for all of us, it becomes easier to discredit and insult opponents from the outset, rather than to open a respectful dialogue aimed at achieving agreement on the deeper level. We can certainly see these challenges daily in our own country, as we are such a divided nation, even a divided church right now. And so the challenge for us, and I don't just mean politicians when I talk about this, but all of us, we have to recover a sense of being a people, Pope Francis writes. He says we have to be men and women capable of coming up with shared goals that transcend their differences and can thus engage in a common endeavor. Just to kind of bring this home, like, when is the last time that you developed a new friendship with someone with a different political viewpoint than you? If you did, you probably connected first as people around shared values or shared interests that you have. And then it was from those shared values or interests that were a foundation to then listen or try to understand in areas that maybe you don't agree with each other. But this is becoming increasingly rare as we get more polarized in our society. There's an often cited poll by The Economist that happened late last year that showed that 38% of both Democrats and Republicans would be somewhat or very upset at the prospect of their child marrying someone from the opposite political party. And that was up from only 5% of people in 1960 who said that they would be displeased with cross-party marriage for their child. So it's just kind of an illustration of how divided we are. Instead of connecting first as people, our first tendency is often to demonize people from across the aisle before we even hear what they have to say. And so we need to recapture social charity in politics, Pope Francis says, because it is social love that is capable of inspiring new ways of approaching the problems of today's world, of profoundly renewing structures, social organizations, and legal systems from within. And so how do we get there? Because that's a really difficult challenge. Well, first, Pope Francis says that we have to recover the sense of belonging to a single human family. We have to recognize that we're all in the same boat. So isolation and withdrawal into one's own interests are never the way to restore hope or bring about renewal. Instead, the inclination to be concerned only with myself or my group or my own petty interests, instead of those things, we have to seek the common good. And he uses this really interesting image of the polyhedron to represent a society where differences can coexist, complementing, enriching, and reciprocally illuminating one another, even amid disagreements or reservations. And he's pretty clear, he's not talking about relativism. Social love, he says, has to be accompanied by a commitment to the truth and informed by both faith and reason. And so what we have to do is identify those values, those common core values that are rooted in truth, such as the dignity of the human person. And it's those kind of common commitments to truth that can unite us despite our differences. And this is also essential, and I think it's an important point to be aware of. He says, we need to learn how to unmask the various ways that the truth is manipulated, distorted, or concealed in public and private discourse. And he says in another place that we have to discern media sources because sometimes powerful special interests seek to tilt public opinion unfairly in their favor. And we all know that that can be the case. That can be done by many, many players. So Pope Francis is hopeful, and he ends very hopeful with some beautiful prayers with that chapter on working together across our different faith traditions, because the call is for us to be one people. The call is for us to cross the borders, cross the walls, develop a sense of universal love, and to work together to arrive at a path forward. And he invites everybody to take up that call individually and as communities. So I think we're probably nearing the end of the time that you have allotted for me. There's a lot of other things that we could talk about. But one thing I do want to mention, Jack mentioned that the prayer that he read at the beginning was from one of our USCCB resources. So we do have a really beautiful and robust Fratelli Tutti study guide that, I think you'll see a lot of these themes that we just covered that we started to delve into. They are really included in a more robust way in the study guide. It includes a prayer that you can use with each of those to really prayerfully go through those materials. It can be done as individuals or as groups. So a great thing to know about. My colleagues in Migration and Refugee Services have put together a study guide that's specifically on the section of Fratelli Tutti that's about migration. If that's an interest, that's an issue of interest, that might be something you might like to look at as well. And then there's also some materials from the Vatican that are kind of summarizing Fratelli Tutti, so sort of a Cliff Notes version. So I want to mention that. And finally, just a reminder, it's CCHD's 50th anniversary, and I have some of our posters in the back, but I am so proud to work with a department of the USCCB that does this great work of supporting local grassroots voices. So I can't end without lifting that up. So I think I will stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to our organizers here. And thank you so much for your attention.
Jill, thank you so very much. It was just really outstanding. I just sent a note to all participants on the call tonight to send their questions to me. Honestly, your presentation was so captivating. I'm thinking people probably weren't even thinking of questions, but I have made an observation. I noticed that you made reference to, of course, the Poverty USA website and how people can click on it and find actually something to do in their area from the website. And I just wanted you to comment on this observation, if your experience is like mine. One of the observations that we've noticed as an organization since COVID, which has mostly been a lot of bad news, but this actually happens to be a piece of interesting and maybe good news, is because of tools like Zoom and the inability to get together in person. People have actually discovered the possibility of forming connections with people outside of the usual places they used to physically walk. So now what we're discovering is when somebody from one parish or one denomination, or one church denomination wants to get something going, they suddenly have discovered via the internet and Zoom that they can form partnerships and prospects that they hadn't really even thought about before, because we typically think about parish boundaries or something. So somebody, for example, I've heard this story a lot this year, somebody who happens to be a member of a particular church where there's not a whole lot going on in the way of social justice or social mission, now finds it like pretty easy to find a way to collaborate because they can make connections with people via Zoom and suddenly they're cooking with gas. I'm wondering if that's been part of your experience, and just wanted to see it highlighted as an asset, I guess.
Yeah, I think that I absolutely agree, Jack. I think there's been many, many challenges that we've all experienced with COVID. There's been so many ways that our organizations have had to adapt, but the gift or the opportunity there is that it has kind of forced a lot of people to become familiar with the tools that we maybe didn't feel comfortable using before. And so, it is possible, for example, I don't know how many of our members in the audience have worked with a community organizing group like the ones that I was mentioning, but my parish, for example, is continuing to do one-to-one meetings to listen to the concerns of people in the neighborhood, to really have a place to encounter and connect, but they're doing them on Zoom, and nobody thought that could be done, but it's happening, right? And so, I think also, certainly, Zoom fatigue can be real. We can get overwhelmed and need to step away from the various resources, but there is a great gift. I think a challenge also, though, is to think about if you're in a ministry setting and you're trying to do ministry, to have in mind those individuals who may not have access to internet that is reliable, that may have additional and other ways of communicating. And so, we don't want to have these Zoom meetings that, are only attended by people who have that access. And so what are the creative ways to navigate that is another, I think, important question.
Sure. Jill, a couple of questions have just popped in. Someone asked the question, Terry asked the question, can you just say more about the phrase social charity? I know that it's popular for some folks, but other people, that phrase is a little bit unfamiliar. Could you speak to that for a few minutes?
Yeah, sure. So I don't know if you noticed, but when I was presenting, even though social charity is pretty consistently used in the encyclical, sometimes social love is used, and they're really kind of interchangeable. But I think in our US context, we're a little bit more familiar with love. And that's, of course, there's the type of like charity that's, giving goods or doing direct services. That's not really the type of charity that's being discussed. It's about an expression of the call to love. And so when we do that in a social way, we are living that call to love that's not just to the individual who's in front of me, but is in a way that's impacting all of society. That's in a way that we're seeking the common good together, that we're trying to impact the social systems that affect everybody. And so that term is especially brought in the encyclical when in the chapter on political charity, political love, right? Because we have to do our politics differently. We have to go beyond, seeing ourselves as distinct from those that we disagree with, and instead develop this sense of social love where we all can work together, inspired by love, to impact the social spheres, the social sectors, the institutions and laws and policies that are going to impact people's well-being.
Mm-hmm. And is there any difference, Jill, between the language of social charity and the language of social justice? Is there some distinction to be made there?
Yeah, so that's another, you're probably thinking of like with the 2 feet of love in action, right? That's, I think, how we've often been familiar with the term charity is we contrast charity and justice, right? Where when we do the work of charity, we meet immediate needs, we do direct service. When we do the work of justice, we're looking at those longer term problems to solutions that can impact large groups of people through changes in structures. So that's another way that we use charity in our language in the United States, the act of charity or the act of justice. I think that's the contrast that you're getting at, Jack.
Great. Somebody who is currently reading Let Us Dream in their Lenten book club wants you to speak to how would you compare or contrast that book to Fratelli Tutti? How would you describe them vis-a-vis each other?
Yeah, so I think, as I was kind of starting to get at, I really recommend that you read both of these excellent documents, if I can get them in the camera here. And they are very, very different in style. I think that would be probably the first kind of difference that I would point out. Fratelli Tutti is an excellent and inspiring document, and it's also really heady. You have to really, you have to read it with a little bit of time. You have to give yourself, pause and process to understand what's being said. Let Us Dream, I think, is sort of a Cliff Notes version in a way, because you are getting a lot of the same themes, a lot of the same concepts, but you're getting it in a different type of language that is much more personal. Pope Francis is talking in the first person. He's telling stories throughout to illustrate the concepts. Another story that I didn't mention in the presentation, but that I really love is when he's talking about the importance of working together with other faith traditions and how we are part of one family and how we need to cultivate that universal love. He talks about how something that impacted him and opened his eyes to this call of solidarity across religions is when he visited a refugee camp in Bangladesh for the Rohingya Muslim who were fleeing from Myanmar. And he talked about being just so moved by that encounter. And he talked about how then he went to another Muslim country and he received an award. And he just felt so moved by that experience that he basically said, I'm giving this award and all of the money that goes with it to this refugee camp because it just left such an impression on him, right? So like what a great illustration that's so memorable of Pope Francis's experience of being personally impacted by connecting and encountering with his Muslim brothers and sisters. So I think that's like, for me, that has been the biggest gift of the Let Us Dream book, is because it just really personalizes it. You see where he's coming from and some of his experiences in wrestling with these issues.
Jill, there are a couple of notes here talking about, well, first of all, just how grateful they are for your presentation tonight and enthused by what you've shared. They'd like to know what would be the first and second step they should take to get the message to their parish.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the first one that I would mention that I've already said before is, we have a great Fratelli Tutti study guide. So if you're in particular interested in how to share Fratelli Tutti with your parish, go to the website, get the study guide, share it with your pastor, try to get some Fratelli Tutti study groups going. I think that would be really, really excellent. I think it's a great pairing with a lot of the excellent Just Faith, programs that you all are doing. But I think, second, that call to think about how, really reflect in your own prayer time how these different invitations that Pope Francis is making need to convert your own heart, because I think that it starts with with all of us and God speaking in our hearts and in our prayer time, and being moved and inspired to see differently than we did before. And it's often in that prayer and reflection that we can do that discernment for where the local opportunities are.
Jill, thank you. This was just so very helpful. I can't tell you how wonderful this presentation has been and how I think useful it is for folks. We're just getting lots of very nice comments in the comment section. And so I just want to invite all of our attendees tonight, if you don't mind, we won't unmute you because it just creates chaos for all. But if you just give a silent clap for Jill tonight, let her know how grateful we are for her time. Thank you so much, Jill.
It was so great to be with you all. Thanks for being with me as well. It was a blessing to be here.
I just want to thank you all again for joining us. To reemphasize a point that Leila made earlier, she'll be sending an email to all of you with the video link to Jill's presentation tonight. Please feel free to share it widely. Maybe that's one step for getting it into your parishes, letting other people see what Jill's had to say. Also, in that email will be an invitation for you to collaborate with us. You see, tonight's presentation was free, and we love providing these at no charge so that everyone can join in. But I'd like to ask those of you who have enough and maybe more than enough resources to share in our work. So specifically, I invite you to take a look at the link in the email that Leila will send to see how you can partner in the work of Just Faith Ministries. Our work is to provide resources that change people who then can change the world. Let me close with a closing prayer again from the resource that Jill referred us to tonight. Let us pray. May your light break through dark clouds, O Lord. May your hope grow in our hearts, even when the skies feel ominous. Fear, isolation, individualism, conflict, these are the winds that blow gusts of racism and inequality in our throwaway world. But we are saved together, not alone. So teach us, Lord, to hope. Show us the goodness you continue to sow. Show us the boldness of love to reject fear and embrace our neighbor. Make fertile the ground where seeds fall, and bring gentle rain and warm days of sunlight. May we know your love shines bright. Through dark clouds, may your hope shine again. Amen. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us, and good night.